Zach Siegel, journalist and researcher living in Chicago. And he recently wrote a piece for Boltz magazine, which I really, really enjoyed, entitled "In Chicago Mayor Race, Policing Dominates Over Violence Prevention Programs." Kind of gives a rundown of the mayoral race, where it all stands, as well as the candidate's relationship with the issue of crime. Zach, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
For sure. So, for people outside of Chicago, where are we currently at, big picture, in this race, which is next Tuesday?
Yeah, it's really coming up, and the race is really messy. There's 9 candidates, so it's really a crowded, packed race. And at the moment, there's about 4 candidates who are polling pretty high, and they're all kind of the front runners. And happy to talk about all of them. I mean, where to start with is probably the incumbent, Mayor Lori Lightfoot. And I think she's really struggled to defend herself and her record from an onslaught of criticism on all sides. And really, crime, yeah, it's the number one, two, three, four, five issue in the campaign. It's really dominated the race. And so the other candidates kind of are all trying to distinguish themselves on that axis. I would say Paul Vallis is another front runner, and he's running to the right of Lightfoot on crime, and he has the police union's endorsement, and he wants to hire more police, wants to prosecute more quote unquote nuisance crimes. And then after Valles is Chewy Garcia, Jesus Chewy Garcia, and his platform is nearly identical to Lightfoot's when it comes to crime. And he kind of frames himself as just a better leader and someone who can deliver on the agenda, because I guess his style, he's just more he's friendlier, he's nicer, like these are his kind of words. And comparing himself to Lightfoot was a former federal prosecutor, and her answers and defenses are very lawyerly, and she's kind of combative and brash and has made a lot of enemies and alienated a lot of her constituencies. And then lastly, I would say Brandon Johnson. He's kind of surging in the polls at the moment, and a lot of the left-wing groups have mobilized around him. He has the backing of the teachers union, and he really rejects the tough on crime position altogether. And his platform is, in his words, investing in people, and that the safest neighborhoods in his eyes don't have more police, they have resources, they have good schools, parks, economic security. And so in Chicago's most violent neighborhoods, he thinks it's not a matter of more police on the beat, but a really a brutal history of divestment and segregation and redlining has kind of all led to this, where the shooting and homicide rate in the city is remarkably high, and that to bring that down will require a massive mobilization of resources. So those are the 4 candidates, but there's 9 of them, so
Right.
it's a crowded race.
And even though, Brandon Johnson, who seems to be clearly like the movement candidate in this race for the left, even he doesn't advocate for defunding. It's just no increase in police funding in his plan, which is just interesting because Valles, I mean, obviously the cop candidate, police union guy, has been that for his entire career pretty much. And has tried to run before. But Chewy Garcia, what is the point of this candidacy? I mean, much respect, former Bernie surrogate, congressman, I get it, but I don't really see what the value is, especially if the left is beginning to kind of coalesce behind someone like Johnson.
Yeah, the political dynamics are kind of confusing on their face in this race. And I think for voters, it's difficult to sort through all the candidates. And as you said, it feels like there's a lot of redundancies and kind of duplicative candidates in this race. And it does seem like Chewy Garcia and Lightfoot are quite similar in their kind of big D democratic politics. And so it's, again, I think, really regional to Chicago, where Chewy Garcia comes from. Neighborhoods like Little Village, which are heavily Latino, whereas Brandon Johnson lives in the Austin neighborhood, which is heavily Black. And so there's a lot of racial politics and very specific neighborhood politics kind of playing out in the city that might have something to do with why certain regions feel like they need their own candidate.
Right. Yeah, it's just, it seems like in terms of Chewy Garcia, he just might be better served in Congress. But let's turn to Lightfoot for a sec. I mean, what a precipitous fall from grace. This is kind of the trajectory, I would say, for any big city mayor. It's very difficult to stand up to powerful police unions. This happened with de Blasio.
Yes.
It's happening with Lightfoot. What were some of the steps that she took politically that you would note as like leading her to this moment where she might be on the precipice of losing in a primary for as an incumbent?
Yeah, it's a huge deal for an incumbent in Chicago to be in her position and being kind of vulnerable in the way that she is. Just to put it in perspective, a incumbent mayor hasn't lost re-election in 34 years. And so the fact that it's even in doubt whether she'll make the runoff is a huge deal. And I think, in terms of like the symbols and the images and the things that stick out in people's minds is that during the uprisings in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered, this kind of image seared in the minds of a lot of Chicagoans with all the bridges leading to the downtown loop were up. And it, in a way, kind of symbolized like her politics are about saving downtown, or about Chicago business, about economics and the financialization of the city, and that to protect Chicago's, Board of Trade and Michigan Avenue, Chanel or whatever stores are there, like that was the priority, is like, we are going to pull up the bridges to make sure that no, looters and protesters, etc., can get downtown. And so I think in a way that image of all those bridges up is one of the big downfalls of Lightfoot, as kind of showing what she aims to protect.
Yeah, and I mean, she's increased police funding every year that she's been in office. There are some other scandals that are escaping me, I guess, but it does seem to be encapsulated in that image that you described there. I mean, what does the polling look like right now? Because as you say, I mean, not that that's determinative of anything, but she's in trouble. I get that. But with the just 9 candidates in the race, it being so split, I would imagine it might be difficult, despite her unpopularity, when it's all said and done, to kick her out of the runoff because there's just so many candidates.
Yeah, Chicago inexplicably has this runoff system. I mean, that's like a residue from the Jim Crow South. Like that's like we think of cities like Atlanta or in states like Georgia, like they have runoff elections as a kind of buffer to like kind of stifle mass democracy. And Chicago has that. And so the top 2 candidates who we're all voting on next Tuesday, they will then face off head to head in an election on April 4th. And so I say, always to take the polling with a grain of salt, because I look back to the coverage in 2019 when Lightfoot was elected, and she was really considered like an afterthought. Like she was considered the also ran, and everyone was really betting on Toni Preckwinkle, another Black woman, and the same things that you said, which is like, why is another Black woman in the race? Like, Toni Preckwinkle seems to have the job. And when Lightfoot got that second seat and faced off against Preckwinkle, she kind of stunned everybody and won and came out of nowhere. And so with the polling right now, it's really hard to say how much of a determinant that will be. And right now, I think it could be, Lightfoot making it to the runoff against, any number of these candidates. And and then there's a situation where she doesn't make the runoff, and that would be another kind of unprecedented loss for an incumbent mayor, which just does not happen in the city.
How right-wing is Valles? I mean, how much of a priority should it be to keep him out of the runoff?
It's so kind of confusing from my perspective, because I'm following, especially what people are saying on public safety, and he is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Valles will, talk one way to the police unions and to the FOP, and say like he's going to hire more police and he's going to fully fund the police and hire more police officers, and we need more police officers on the beat. He'll beat that drum, and then to a different audience he'll say, I'm going to address the root causes of crime, and we need to invest in our communities, and we need to make the school day longer. We need more after school programming. We need kids to have good recreational experiences so that they have a better life and they're not on the street. And so he's saying everything to everybody all at once, and being, I think, trying to be a savvy politician. And so in my mind, how right-wing is he? It depends who he's talking to and on the day.
Well, the fact that he's like talking to the police union and is getting their support, I feel like that's probably as determinative really as it gets. But I mean, it's just sometimes it's really is just the nature of the office too. It's so difficult institutionally to stand up to these incredibly powerful police unions. And that was something that you highlight in your piece, which I think is a tension that's difficult to flesh out. The all of these candidates, for the most part, or many of them, include community violence intervention groups as a part of their platform. And there also is this tension when you go to a town hall or something and people are complaining, rightfully so, or they're fearful of crime in their backyard. And it seems like many politicians have struggled to connect policies of community investment with like genuine community fears about crime. I mean, how much of that tension has been present in this race?
I think that's been one of the number one conflicts that keeps bubbling up to the surface all the time. And it's really difficult, I think, especially for Lightfoot. Like, a lot of the kind of Lakeshore white liberals voted her in to office, and they're really upset now that there's carjackings in their neighborhood and things like that. And so someone has to address that while also talking to a young Black mother on the South Side whose 12, 13-year-old, 14-year-old child was just murdered. Like, those are two very different kinds of crime and two very different levels of public safety. And so it's hard to talk to both audiences at once who need very different things and have very different fears. And one of the problems with the politics, I think, of gun violence in Chicago is that it's highly concentrated, and that just 6 out of 77 neighborhoods account for almost a third of all of the shootings. And it just so happens in these neighborhoods, voter turnout is not that high. And so there's like a constituency aspect to this where politicians, just don't really see the Black communities on the South and West Side as the people who are going to put them in office. And so it's just it kind of feeds this vicious loop of neglect that I think has plagued Chicago for so long.
It's very similar in other cities, right? I mean, so much of the like in New York, the New York Post's crime focus is really just about trying to appeal to those same, white upper class, middle class, often suburbanites, bridge and tunnelers who want New York City to be a pristine playground when they want to go to dinner or go to MSG. But the reality of like what violent crime does is the brunt is borne by communities that the incentive for that first group is just to crack down on those communities as opposed to general community investment. And that I feel like is kind of thematic with city politics across the country. I mean, it's different in LA, it's different in New York, whatever, Chicago. But I see a parallel there that the bridge is just has not been built to kind of borrow your metaphor from earlier.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think it's whose problem is this? And truly, if we want to look at it just calmly and rationally, like it is all of our problem. When young people are shot, they go to a trauma center. They get very expensive health care, and we pay for that. All of us do. And I think it's hard for the kind of white liberals in Bucktown and Logan Square, where I live, to kind of understand that aspect of it, that shootings in the south and west sides do affect us, and not just financially, just as a city. It's the loss of human life is staggering, and no one should be okay. Like, this is not just some fact of life that I think we should learn to live with. 700 homicides every year is obscene, and there are things that can be done about it, which is what my story was really about, which is there are programs and organizations, community violence intervention, as you mentioned, that do have very rigorous programmatic approaches to reducing gun violence. And it starts by investing in those young people who are at extremely high risk of either being a target of a shooting or committing a shooting themselves. And without investing in them, without creating a future and a better life for them, there's just no way to solve this problem. It is about healing those neighborhoods and healing those people who are frankly traumatized. Their exposure to gun violence is far and above what any Iraqi or Afghanistan veteran has ever seen. And they're teenagers in an American city. It is brutal, and it should not be happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Lastly, just to bring it back to the race for anybody that's listening that's in Chicago, is it a general consensus that the best chance for a more leftist candidate, movement candidate, in this race would be Johnson? Is that really kind of what you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, both on the ground and in polling, he has the best chance of all the kind of lefty candidates who are in the race to make the runoff. And as I said, there's a lot of organizing around him and mobilizing around him, and people are excited by his message, and so people are really pinning their hopes to Brandon Johnson right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zach Siegel. You can read his piece in Boltz magazine. Really appreciate your time today. And again, guys, voting in Chicago is on Tuesday.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.